While fulfilling compliance requirements can seem like an onerous task for small AFS licensees, it's nonetheless compulsory. Given ASIC's drive to raise standards across the financial planning industry, it's crucial that licensees, or those thinking about setting up a practice under their own AFS license, understand what they need to do to stay compliant. Small licensees face the same compliance obligations as all AFS licensees, but generally have much less time and resources to dedicate to this critical part of their business practices. Premium Wealth Management's Shannon Durant says that as a starting point, small AFS licensees should ensure they become familiar with the ASIC regulatory guides related to financial planning to understand their compliance requirements.
So it's important that if you're working with a licensee, you know which ones that you're supposed to be familiar with, and I'd recommend RG104 and RG105. They cover your general obligations, and I'd also recommend that everyone reads the breaches and the conflicts of interest regulatory guides as well.
RG104 sets out the general obligations AFS licensees have under the Corporations Act. The guide states licensees need to provide their services efficiently, honestly and fairly, have adequate arrangements to manage conflicts of interest, comply with the conditions on their license and financial services laws, and take reasonable steps to ensure representatives comply with financial services laws. RG105 outlines the responsible manager requirements for licensees, and RG181 provides guidance for licensees on disclosing, controlling, and avoiding conflicts of interest.
Firstly, the most important thing is that you identify all your conflicts of interest, that you document them in a conflicts of interest register, and that you have a very good think about how you can manage those conflicts of interest and whether or not those conflicts can actually be managed. So you may be able to disclose the conflict in your financial services guide or your statement of advice.
RG78 explains the obligation that licensees have to report certain breaches of the law to ASIC. AFS licensees must tell ASIC in writing within 10 business days about any significant breach or likely breach of their obligations. RG78.24 says the content of a written breach report should include the date of the breach, a description of the breach, why the breach is significant, how the breach was rectified, and steps taken to ensure future compliance. Henderson Maxwell's Sam Henderson says keeping a register of all breaches is part of a robust compliance culture for small licensees.
Well, it's interesting. When ASIC has gone into some of the small financial services licensees, they've actually found no breach register, or a breach register that's empty, or a complaints register that's empty. That actually spikes interest.
There are several ways small licensees can handle fulfilling their compliance obligations. These include externally, where compliance functions are outsourced to a third party, internally, where all compliance functions of a licensee are taken care of in-house, and the hybrid model, which includes a mix of both internal processes and outsourcing. Each approach has its own benefits and risks. Durant explains while outsourcing certainly allows small AFS licensees to save time and energy by tapping into the expertise of a specialist, it doesn't let licensees off the hook if something goes wrong.
So it's important for smaller licensees to be aware that even if they outsource policies, they can outsource the compliance function, but they can never outsource the liability. That always lies with the licensee.
The best approach to manage compliance will depend on each licensee's structure and situation. Durant says in the past, Premium Wealth Management outsourced its compliance obligations, but found that issues were being dealt with more quickly after compliance was brought internally.
But what they've found is when they've brought compliance completely in-house, they have their finger on the pulse a lot better, so that if anything arises, it's dealt with immediately, instead of perhaps if you outsource your auditing and you're not picking up an issue until 12 months later when the auditor comes back in.
According to Henderson, a good option for small AFS licensees can be using a mix of both internal processes and also to use an external compliance specialist. He says the main benefit of this model is that an external compliance firm can act as a second pair of eyes for the licensee.
They'll come in and do a file audit, they'll look at our authorised representatives and also a licensee review. So they'll look at all the procedures and policies that we have in place. Then they'll go down to actually analysing the files, opening up the files, seeing what procedures we've followed throughout the first appointment or even the initial contact with the client.
External compliance providers can also assist with the challenging task of keeping compliance procedures consistent across advice firms in different locations.
Yeah, we have a Sydney office and a Melbourne office, so all the procedures that we have in Sydney need to be implemented in Melbourne. And that's been a bit of a challenge in recent years, I suppose, making sure that all offices are doing the same thing. I think we've done a fairly good job of it. We analyse it both internally but also using our external compliance company.
Henderson says using an external compliance specialist can cost over $10,000 and up to $30,000 annually, depending on the services required by the licensee and the number of clients and authorised representatives it has. Durant says the cheapest and most effective solution for smaller licensees is to potentially train up a support staff member, such as a paraplanner, to become a compliance specialist. ASIC is responsible for monitoring financial services businesses and enforcing the law to ensure that licensees stay compliant and operate efficiently, honestly and fairly. There are several methods ASIC employs to assess whether licensees, big or small, are complying with their obligations. These include regularly checking the websites of licensees for any misleading or deceptive information, breach notifications from licensees, conducting shadow shopping campaigns where ASIC recruits consumers to get financial advice, client complaints, sending questionnaires to licensees to analyse the strength of their compliance systems.
FOS is also obligated to report client complaints to ASIC as well, so that's another way that they get their information. And more recently, ASIC have been active in actually asking licensees to complete questionnaires on how they're conducting their business, and they're actually also asking for statements of advice.
Henderson advises that when it comes to compliance breaches, licensees should be proactive and take action to fix problems.
ASIC want to see proactivity, so they want to make sure that if you do recognise an issue or a problem, a complaint, that you take action. They don't want to see inaction. They don't want to see you sitting on your hands or denial or putting your head in the sand about something. They want to see changes.
There are severe consequences for persistent or significant compliance breaches.
ASIC can suspend your licence, cancel your licence, and on occasion they may agree to an enforceable undertaking, which can be cost prohibitive because you may be required to hire auditors, external auditors like PricewaterhouseCoopers or Ernst & Young, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars depending on what it is that they have to help you rectify and how long they're required to be there.
Henderson says that the responsible managers of small licensees need to take the lead in promoting a robust compliance structure and ensuring that staff also embrace the ideology through regular training.
Have your own processes in place, your procedures in place, written procedures. Make sure you train your staff regularly and make sure your staff have a good understanding of what the implications of non-compliance are. Then make sure you're paying for or investing in an external consultant and get them to come in and make sure your internal procedures are sufficient enough to meet the ASIC regulations.
A good way to get staff involved in compliance issues is by creating a risk register in which everyone can identify any compliance concerns they have and meet often to discuss those issues and how they could be rectified.
So with business risk, we look at everything, not just Corporations Act requirements, but we also look at OH&S staffing issues as well if we were to lose a key person. And it's really a living, breathing document. So we have a register that's reviewed at our board meetings. It's not a set and forget document. We look at it once a month.